Good afternoon, everybody. I am waiting you for joining my class. I don't know what's the problem. I hope you are able to attend the class. Okay, I'm gonna share the slides. Let me upload the PowerPoint presentation for you. Okay. I hope you are able to see these slides. Are you able to join the class, please? If you have a problem, exercising problem, please let me know because I can spend the time for waiting you. The aggregate demand and aggregate supply I'm going to present you today. As you know, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply, we presented you last lecture. The shifts in aggregate demand and aggregate supply causes inflation. Is also important in the subject, the supply side economics and how the government can influence the economy is going to be questioned and analyzed. As you know, the aggregate demand amount is very important because we are going to concentrate to the demand side of the economics, the amount of the real domestic output which domestic consumers, businesses, governments, and foreign buyers collectively will desire to purchase at each possible price level is subjected to the aggregate demand in the nation's level. Consumption and demand is subjected. The demand curve, the aggregate demand curve is illustrated here. As you know, the real GDP is on the x-axis and the price on the y-axis. If you have any question, please let me know. I don't know what is the problem that you are not attending. Really, this is really very disappointing for me. From you, sorry. I don't understand why you are not able to attend the class regularly. I hope you will attend. Okay. The aggregate demand is downward sloping, as I mentioned to you in the last lecture. The real balance effects, the foreign purchasing effects, and the interest rate effects are subjected here. Why it is downward sloping? As I mentioned to you, between the real GDP and the so-called price and inflation, there is inverse relation. As much as the price going up, the demand capacity, the real GDP is supposed to be, the consumption capacity is supposed to be reduced, or vice versa. When the consumption is increased, it is expected that the price is down. The balance effect, the real balance effect, the higher prices reduce the real spending power, as you are understanding from the economical aspects. The price and output are negatively related. As much as the price reduces, the real spending power, price and output are negatively related. The output and price, the general price level is negatively related because consumption and the demand capacity is depending to this effect. Foreign purchasing effect. When domestic prices are high, we will export less to foreigner buyers and we will import more from foreign producers. Therefore, high prices leads to a less domestic output. This can be discussed a little bit comprehensively. When the inflation is in the market, as you are understanding, the demand capacity for the imported goods is reduced, but the exportable goods in the foreign countries is expected to enlarge because the currency, the domestic currency becomes cheaper, and the price effect, which is reduce the value of the currency, is supposed to become more depreciated in the foreign currencies, and the exportable goods in foreign countries becomes enlarged, and people in the foreign countries in the outland is expected to increase, and this is then somehow is realized, this inflationary policies is continuously realized for increasing the economic activities and enlarging the economic capacity of the market. And the opposite is also realized for the domestic market. People with less, let's say, currency or weak currency because of the inflation are not able to buy the imported goods, and this directing them to buy some domestic internal goods and services, and this somehow is assumed to be politically and economically good for the economy, but in the long run this is not a very good economy policy, because most of the countries who are depending the foreign energy and foreign inputs are suffering, because in the long run this effect is not becoming very profitable, because people and the producers who are using this foreign energy and inputs are still require some foreign currency to buy this energy and inputs for being able to maintain their production. And result of this is then economy is stagnating. And this is not good for the whole economy in the long run. The interest rate effects is also similarly, as you are understanding, as much as the interest rate and the inflation is parallelly, is no problem, but in the economical, let's say, considerations, unfortunately, the price is going very faster than the interest rate. It is not very easily adapted and parallelly equalize the interest rate, so-called the nominal interest rate and the inflation. And this is then problem for the economy, because as much as you are increasing the prices and the prices going up and the interest rate is not, then this will then cause some problem to the economy, because then the interest rate causes some wealth effect, because your wealthiness is going to down or is going to reduce, because your purchasing power parity is reduced, and results of this, then you are not able to buy and with this capital that you are having in the bank account, as in the past year, let's say, or in the former years. Therefore, interest rate must be adapted, must be equalized to the inflation for getting somehow consolidated capital and interest for your resources and loanable funds that you are saving in the banking account. To aggregate supply, the level of the real domestic output available at each possible price level is supposed to be then is affected by the prices, and as much as you are increasing the prices, the supply side of the economy is becoming enlarged and become much more. And on the other side, as I mentioned to you, the aggregate demand is opposite of this. Then as much as you are increasing the prices, this will not affect the consumer demand positively. It is affecting negatively. Due to this reason, we have to manage the both parties, the suppliers and the demanders, interest and preferences for maintaining the sustainable economic model. On the graphic, we are illustrating the Keynesian range, which is a parallel line to the real GDP, which is supposed to be in the short run is not effectively affected from the price changes. And in the classical range, as you are observing, it is again ineffective when the prices changes. And in the intermediate economical regulations, it is somehow become effective. And we are always preferring this intermediate range for maintaining our aggregate supply curve, because in Keynesian economics, as you are observing, the price level is fixed in the short run, and in the classical economy, it is not dependent to the price changes. Therefore, this issue is going to be managed in the intermediate medium run economical activities. The Keynesian approach assumed large amounts of unemployment make it so that the increase in aggregate demand have no effects on wages or prices. So the prices are ineffective. The classical economical aspect, the full employment makes it so that the increase in aggregate demand only increase wages and prices suggested. An intermediate range is some sectors of the economy reach full employment more quickly than others. As you are observing, it is somehow an increasing part of the economy is subjected here. Do you hearing me? I don't understand why you are not able to attend. You are kidding with me. I don't understand what is happening. Is this normal? You're not attending the class? I don't understand what's the problem. This is really funny. I don't know what's the problem that you're not able to attend the class, but I have to ask, I think, because this is not normal. How I'm going to wait you for participating in my class? Is there any option? Variables that shift aggregate demand curve, the taxes, interest rate, confidence, strength of the dollar, and government spending is affected and changing the aggregate demand curve. As you see, the aggregate demand is affected from the taxes. When you are increasing the taxes, it is expected that the demand capacity is reduced. Or when you are decreasing the taxes, then demand is expected to enlarge the aggregate demand, of course, we are talking about. Similarly, when you are increasing the interest rate, people force or desire to save is increased, and vice versa. When you are reducing the interest rate, then it is also expected that the consumption enlarge, and strength of the dollar is similarly affecting the import, and opposite is affected for export. The government spending similarly, as much as the government spending is enlarged, then this is then affecting the aggregate demand also, or when the government spending is reduced, then the demand is, of course, affected. And the confidence is also very important, because as much as you are having some speculative actions as in some confidence measures, then this is then affecting the demand in the future or in the present market. Therefore, this confidence measures and confidence building measures is affecting and changing the aggregate demand curve very much. When we are looking at the determinants of the aggregate demand, the variables which is affecting and changing the economy is given here. I'm letting you to look up a little bit to this table, then I will present. Okay, when you are looking to the taxes, as I mentioned to you, the effects on the GDP components, so-called the C, consumption, I, investment, G, governmental expenditures, and X, net export, so-called export minus import, is affected. And here, when the taxes going up, the consumption and investment is affected. As you are observing here, if it is increased, effects of the aggregate demand when the taxes change and it is affected, then it is negatively affecting the aggregate demand. Because taxes somehow is a burden on the consumers. And from this point of view, when the tax rate is increased, and this is then negatively affecting the aggregate demand, and vice versa is also for the decrease. When this is decreased, then this is then when the components of the decrease, when the effects of on the aggregate demand when GDP components decreases, then this is expected increase on the tax and aggregate demand is realized. Decrease on the tax is realized and increase the aggregate demand. The interest rate, similarly, the effects of the GDP components, consumption and investment is affected as much as you are understanding. The consumption heavily affected because the interest rate when it's going up, the consumer prefer to save, and when this go down, then vice versa. In interest rate, similarly, when the interest rate is high, people prefer to invest less, and vice versa. When the interest rate is low, then people prefer to borrow more and invest much. And the effects of on the aggregate demand when GDP components is increased here, then is, as you are observing here, is causing decrease on the aggregate demand, and effects on aggregate demand when the GDP components decreases, then the increase on the aggregate demand is expected. The confidence, as I mentioned to you, so-called the trending in the future, what will cause to the economy. The consumption and investment supposed to be the components of the GDP is considered. And here, as I said to you, the effects on the aggregate demand when the GDP component increases causes some increase on the aggregate demand, and the effects on the aggregate demand when GDP components decreases, the decrease on the aggregate demand is expected. The domestic currency X exports, imports, decrease export, but increase import demand is subjected when the effects on the aggregate demand when GDP components increases, and effects on the aggregate demand when GDP components decreases, increase or decrease. Here the confidence is, as you are seeing, the result cause some decrease on the aggregate demand. And domestic currency, so-called the subjected to the export minus imports, the net export. When the effects on the GDP and GDP components increases and large, the components CIGX, consumption, investment, governmental expenditure, and net export, decrease export but increase import, so-called aggregate demand is supposed to be reduced, because domestic currency, when it is appreciated, it causes some export increase, and this will then cause some import. And when the currency is depreciated, then the export is supposed to be increased and import is decreased, and the aggregate demand is supposed to be enlarged for the foreigners. I don't know what is happening, but you are trying to join the class. I don't know, but I can wait you. I'm going through to this presentation. If you are having problem with this, then let me know, because I have written to you. You didn't respond me, so I have to go through to finish the presentation. Do you have any question? I don't know. Here is illustrated, as I said to you, in the Keynesian economics, the vertical part of this aggregate supply is represented, which is fixed, the price, and in the intermediate or medium term, it is somehow increasing, and we are always preferring this medium term. And in the classical economy, it is supposed to be the aggregate supply is not affected from the price changes in the long run. In the short run is, of course, all parties become subjected from the price changes. Here, the aggregate demand, as you are observing, results of these price changes in the intermediate period is affected, and then aggregate demand is going or moving from aggregate demand to aggregate demand dash, and price star goes to the price dash, which increase the prices, causing some aggregate demand changes, and supply is expected to increase. Variables that shift the aggregate supply, the input prices, productivity, and government regulations. The input prices heavily affecting, as I said to you, because as much as the input price is going up, the production operation process become expensive, and results of this, either the wages will be reduced and expected to maintain the similar price level, or the wages, if not then reduced, then the input price, as a result of this energy prices, which is increased the production operation process, will cause some price increase, and results of this, the inflation in the market is expected. The productivity is also affected, and change the aggregate supply. Aggregate supply is affected from the productivity, because as much as you become productive, the aggregate amount of the production operation process is becoming effectively high. And if your productivity, let's say delta Q over delta L, if the employee capacity is low, then the productivity is becoming low. And if the productivity per capita per hour, let's say, or per person per hour, then becomes lower. And due to this reason, delta Q over delta L, which is, let's say, in an hour, production capacity divided to the in an hour employees capacity, is going to be the productivity for the labor, or for the other parties for the capital. Delta Q over delta K is the capital productivity, and in an hour is the, if the produced amount is not too much regarding to the employed capital, this will then reduce the productivity, and results of this, then the aggregate supply is supposed to be reduced. And the government regulations, such as higher taxes or too many fees and other things, will reduce this aggregate supply. And at the end, if there is a higher minimum wage estimated for the government, to the sectors, will then reduce the productivity, because the employers must pay much money for the employee, and this will then cause some resource transfer from the producers to the employee, and this will then cause some profit reduction. And when this is happened, then aggregate supply either will reduce, or will then the prices shifted higher level, which is also negatively affecting the whole economy. Either these higher prices will stagnate and reduce the aggregate demand, and results of this, in the next season, the aggregate supply curve is expected to also reduce. Determinants which is affecting the aggregate supply. When we are looking to the determinants here, the variables is given: input prices, productivity, and government's regulation. As I mentioned, the effects of an increase on aggregate supply, as I mentioned, the input prices decrease as much as it is affected by these price changes. As I said, if the input prices is increased, and this will then cause some negative impact to the aggregate supply. And if the input prices is decreasing, then this will then cause some negative effects and decrease the aggregate supply by increase the aggregate supply. Results of this input price reduction and productivity is supposed to be effects on the increase on the aggregate supply is increased. So then the effects on decrease on the aggregate supply then is supposed to be decreased. Results of this differences on the wages, difference on the prices, which I mentioned to you in the former slide. And the government regulations also, the tax and everything, higher minimum wages, causes some increase on the aggregate supply. If it is reduced, the taxes, or if it is increased, then this will then cause some decrease. The figure, as I mentioned to you, representing here again the aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And as you are observing, as much as the prices fall down, then this will then cause some aggregate demand enlargement. The real GDP, so-called, is expanded. And as you observe, the aggregate supply is also shifted, but reduced to the lower level. If it is up, the real GDP expected to reduce, but the aggregate supply is enlarged and increased here, and demand is, aggregate demand is reduced here, as you're observing. This is all happen on the intermediate period or position or run, or let's say medium run. Causes of inflation: demand pull inflation. Inflation caused by an increase in the aggregate demand, and cost push inflation. Inflation caused by a decrease in aggregate supply. Demand pull inflation. As you are observing here, inflation caused by an increase in the aggregate demand. This is somehow pulling effect. And demand pull inflation exists when aggregate demand for a goods or services outstrips aggregate supply. It starts with an increase in consumer demand. Sellers meet such an increase with more supply, but when additional supply is unavailable, sellers rise their prices. If we go a little bit further, it is the most common cause of inflation. The other reasons, cost push inflation, as I mentioned to you, is in the second runner, is rare. It starts with a decrease in total supply or an increase in the cost of that suppliers, or rises and prices because they known as consumers will pay it, or will be, of course, in the suffer. The situation called inelastic demand. There is also some causes for this pull inflation. The first one is the growing economy. The first is a growing economy. When families feel confident, they spend more instead of saving. They expect to get rises and better jobs. They know their homes and their investments will increase in value. They feel that the government is doing the right things in guiding the economy. They will also borrow more, either will auto or home loans or credit cards. If they don't borrow too much, this is a healthy cause of inflation. It creates gradual and steady price increase. The second is the expectation of inflation. Former Federal Reserve banking policies is one of the important of this supporter. Once people expect inflation, they will buy things now to avoid higher future prices. The increase is demand. which then creates demand pull inflation. Once the expectation of inflation set in, it's hard to eradicate. For example, businesses expected higher interest rate and inflation in the 1970s. That created galloping inflation. At the same time, the wages price controls which slowed economic growth. The combination creates stagflation, as I mentioned in the last session, where the prices and the unemployment bilaterally enlarge. The over expansion of the money supply is the third causes of this. That is when there is too much money cashing to few goods, which means the monetary easing enlarged, that occurs when this government prints too much money, either monetary easing or monetary enlargement or printing directly. That occurs when the government distributes this money. It does this to pay much debt. Oversupply of money is the primary driver of hyperinflation. It can also occur if the Fed puts too much credit into the banking system. Discretionary fiscal policies. Government spending drives up demand according to the Keynesian economy theory. For example, military spending raises prices for military equipment. When the government lowers taxes, it also drives demand, as in the Keynesian economy says, you have to reduce the taxes or increase the incomes for enlarging the economical activity from the demand side of the economy, which is supplied by the Keynesian economics. The consumers have more discretionary income to spend on goods and services. When that increases faster than supply, it creates inflation. For example, tax breaks for mortgage interest rates increase demand for housing. Government sponsors of mortgage guarantors stimulated demand, although there were many other reasons for the housing bubbles. And the other cause is strong branding. Marketing can create high demand for certain products, a form of asset inflation. A great example is Apple products, including the iPod, iPad, and iPhone. Price for these goods are higher than comparable products. That's because the consumer feels Apple understands their needs, including emotional ones. There is a certain coach to owning an Apple product that allows Apple to change and charge higher prices. The technological innovation is the last one. The companies creates a new technology and technique and distributing brand new marks to the market, and the companies figure out how to stop this and enlarge the market structure with this newly introduced brand marks and products. People will demand products with technologies that create real improvement in their daily lives. The new technologies also creates a catch for those who must own their latest gadget. For example, Tesla's electric sports car wash technological breakouts. It used new advanced motors, powertrains, and battery packets, and so on. And if we are giving some example for the pull inflation is the credit default swap, where a new type of insurance product is illustrated. They guaranteed against default on mortgage and other kind of loans. This coverage generated higher demand for another innovation, asset-backed securities. This allowed securities that track the prices of mortgages to be sold on a secondary market, such like stocks. For the cost push, as I said to you, inflation caused by a decrease in aggregate supply and when it occurs, it creates problem because inflation causes a decrease in the aggregate supply, and when the decrease in the aggregate supply is realized, this is somehow a recession. This is reducing the economical activities. The cause of cost push inflation, also known as wage push inflation, occurs when overall price increases, as I said, the inflationary measure or pressure. Due to increases in the cost of wages and raw materials, higher energy prices causes this cost of production and can decrease the aggregate supply because of this higher cost of production. The amount of product in the economy will reduce, and results of this reduction, the prices going up and the demand capacity will stagnating and reducing this consumption. Since the demand for goods and services reduce is a problem, but if it is not changed, then the price is expected to increase, and this will then cause some inflationary pressure into the economy. The cost push inflation occurs when overall prices increase due to increase in the cost wages and raw materials, and cost push inflation occurs when the higher cost of production decrease the aggregate supply, the amount of total production in the economy, and since the demand of goods hasn't changed and stay intact, the price increase causing a production are passed out to the consumers and creating cost push inflation because of this cost effect. Okay. The government influences on the aggregate demand. The government can influence economic activities with aggregate demand side policies affecting, as I said, to the tax, the government spending and interest rates. I have already mentioned to you the taxes. If it is increased, the taxes, the government demand, the aggregate demand is supposed to be reduced and restricted, limited because of the tax which is applied to the products or to the incomes. And the government spending, if it is going to enlarge, this is also affecting and changing the demand. And interest rate, if it is going up, this is then speculative and increasing the saving capacity for the consumers who are holding the disposable income in their hands. And if the interest rate is fall down, then this is then accelerating the aggregate demand. Government influence on the aggregate supply. Government can influence economic activities with aggregate supply side policies, which is affected by the input cost, as I said to you in the cost price cost push inflation. Input costs will be increased, labor wages increased, reducing the regulations somehow affecting and changing, and increase in incentives to work. The risks, these are all affecting and change. The actions are called supply side economies, which is affecting the supply side of the economy. Okay, I will stop here since you are also not attending today's class. I don't want to go further. I am expecting that you will attend next lecture next week to the class regularly. Please communicate with me and let me know what is problem with this and we'll solve it, because this is not acceptable, because you have to be able to join the class regularly. Okay, I'm stopping here and hoping that you will listen and watch these videos after I uploading it. Thank you.